ASEH 2015 here in Washington, D.C. Today was day 4, the final full day of panels and papers here at the conference. And I'll give you a bit of a recap of what I saw and then talk broadly about some themes that emerged at this year's conference. So the day for me started out on my own panel on Canadian energy history called Rethinking Canada, a Fossil Fuel Nation. I was joined by Ruth Sandville and Andrew Watson, and we dealt with 3 different energy commodities in Canadian history from the late 19th century right up to the near present. Ruth looked at a case study of the consumption of manufactured gas for lighting in urban Canada, a particular fossil fuel commodity that has a very early history in Canada. Andrew followed up by taking a look at the coal problem in the interwar period, the problem being that the major sites of consumption for coal were based in Ontario and Quebec, in parts of the country where there were no coal deposits, but the 2 primary regions with coal deposits, the first in Nova Scotia, the second in Alberta, were located at vast distances from the major points of consumption. And Andrew gave us that case study of the interwar period challenges for getting Canadian coal to Canadian markets. And then finally, I rounded off the session with my current research project on the history of oil pipeline spills in Canada, doing a quantitative history of the safety performance of long-distance oil pipelines operated under the regulatory authority of the National Energy Board. We had a fantastic discussion with the audience after the session, and in particular there were 2 questions that came up that I think we're going to need to think about as we go forward with our research in Canadian energy history. The first was how energy history can get us to rethink Canadian history, and the second was whether or not Canadian energy history can get us to rethink global energy history. On the first question, I think we're starting to get there. The point of organizing this session on fossil fuels was to start to get Canadian historians thinking about Canada not just as a resource nation for staples like fish and wood and other mineral resources, but to be thinking about Canada as an energy-producing nation in a much deeper time period, going back deeper into Canada's past. And in the case of fossil fuels, Canada has had quite a long fossil fuel history, from manufactured gas to coal to crude oil to synthetic crude oil, now in the present. In terms of what effect Canadian energy history has had on global energy history, the only thing I can say at this point is stay tuned. I'm starting in my own research to see hints of evidence that Canadian engineers, pipeline engineers, played a role in the development in terms of the history of science and engineering of pipelines for crude oil transportation. But it's still a little bit too early in my own research to make any definitive statements about Canada's influence on oil pipeline construction globally. The second session I went to was also a Canadian session. I had a bit of a Canadian theme today. This one was called 5 Centuries of Climate Change, Towards a Climate History of Canada. And in fact, this session was a pre-Confederation Canadian history session. Dagmar de Groot gave us a case study of climate history involving the 3rd and 4th voyages of Henry Hudson, in which he illustrated some broader themes in his approach to energy history, showing the ways in which the Little Ice Age can't simply be thought of in a declensionist manner. The cooling of the global climate didn't only lead to negative consequences, but it could actually be productive and shift the course, in the case of the voyages of Henry Hudson, to areas or territories of the Earth that might not have gone explored by European navigators had it not been for sea ice being located in particular parts of the globe. The second paper in that panel was by Colin Coates, and he took a look at New France and the climate history of New France, with a really fascinating finding regarding how colonists in New France grappled with the cold. The colony, the main base of the colony in Quebec in New France in the 17th century, was further south than Paris, and this was confusing to colonists why the climate would be colder further south. And so what Colin found was that in their writing about weather and climate, they anticipated being able to alter or modify the climate through deforestation. The clearing of forest would inevitably, many colonists in New France believed, bring the climate of New France into closer alignment with France itself. So this was a really interesting paper. Teresa DeVore from the University of New Brunswick gave a paper called Living Weather and Survival, Local Knowledge in the Maritimes in the 18th and 19th century, and persisted with this theme of looking at individual qualitative case studies of the experiences of weather and climate. And Teresa's research in this paper was very much animated by efforts to try and understand what the lived experiences of weather were like. So she gave us evidence from the diaries of ordinary colonists in New Brunswick in the 18th and 19th centuries. I went to a roundtable panel on environmental history, education, and sustainability studies. This was a really fascinating panel that got me thinking about the ways in which environmental history can be used to help us better understand sustainability. Claire Campbell raised a couple of important and insightful points, I thought, in her remarks on the roundtable. The first was that she made a case for using the colonial period in North American history as a way of teaching sustainability, thinking into the deeper past, not just in modern American and Canadian history, but into the colonial period, to think about what legacies of the colonial period we live with, but also what kinds of alternative relationships with nature can be interpreted by looking at 17th, 18th, and early 19th century American and Canadian history. The second point that she made was about scale and geography when she teaches environmental history and sustainability. And she made the case that the continental scale was perhaps the most useful scale to operate in to try and connect with students to convey how environmental history can help us understand sustainability. The local scale wasn't necessarily useful for her students who, in many instances, were not from the local area where her university is located. The global scale was too broad to make an intimate connection with the topics that she was discussing. But a continental scale was something that was kind of in the middle, I suppose, where students could make connections in their everyday lives to the history that they were examining. Finally, I wrapped up this conference by going to an incredible panel on the internationalization of nature protection in North America, a comparative panel of national parks in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. 3 of the papers dealt with the Canadian-US relationship in terms of national parks, and the 4th paper dealt with Mexico. And this panel, broadly speaking, got the audience thinking about national parks beyond the American case study. Was this truly just America's best idea, or as Alan McEachern said, was this actually Canada's best idea, given that Canada established the first National Parks Administration 5 years before the United States? So again, I had a bit of a Canadian theme to the end of the day here. So I want to wrap up by talking about 4 themes that emerged during the conference that I think are prevailing trends right now in environmental history. This is an image from Alan's presentation on an address given by the Dominion Parks Commissioner, James Harkin, which they spelled his name wrong, James Harker. Okay, the first theme, the Anthropocene. Thinking about the global effects of humans on the biosphere of the Earth. This was a theme that was quite common in some of the earlier sessions in the conference this year, and something that I think is going to be persistent. Environmental historians are now quite attuned to this idea that we're living in a new epoch in which the prevailing agent of ecological and geological change on Earth is human beings. So while we are debating the meaning of the term Anthropocene and the utility of the term Anthropocene, I think the important point to be taken away from this is that we can look back at a period that goes back up to 200 to 250 to 300 years to try and understand the emergence of our contemporary circumstances whereby humans have become the predominant agent of ecological and geological change on Earth. And I think this is something, regardless of the terminology, that environmental historians are going to need to explore and examine. The second theme was energy history. There were many panels. I spent an entire day just going to panels on energy history, looking at a wide range of energy commodities, from hydroelectricity to manufactured gas to crude oil to nuclear power. This is a field, I think, that has so many more possibilities of exploration, but most significantly, the implications of rethinking history from an energy perspective, I think, are quite profound, and there were many examples from the papers that were given at the conference that are providing environmental historians with new ways of thinking about the past. Marine environmental history, I think, emerged quite powerfully at the conference. Several panels focused on a variety of aspects of the relationships between humans and the sea. This was something that came up in a forum in the journal several years ago as a new area in environmental history that was understudying, and I think we're beginning to see new research in this area. So keep an eye out for more studies on marine environmental history, and for the Canadian readers of the site, it's something to think about how we might expand our understanding of Canadian marine environmental history. And the final theme that emerged at the conference was Canada itself, and the chair of our panel, Chris Jones, brought this up, that there was a not overwhelming, but a significant representation of Canada at the ASEH this year. There were a handful of panels that were devoted solely to Canadian topics, but we were also seeing Canada emerge in transnational topics that were discussed at the conference, particularly in the context of energy history. So Canadian environmental history was well represented, which I think was a good reflection of the strength of the field in Canada, but also a recognition globally of the role that Canada has played in a number of topics that are relevant to environmental history. And that's the end of the American Society for Environmental History annual meeting here in Washington, D.C. I hope these recap videos have been helpful, and if you want to keep reading and listening and watching more things about Canadian environmental history, just stay tuned here to niche-canada.org.